Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The science hasn't changed, but the policy has. EPA's repeal of the Endangerment Finding removes the legal foundation for regulating climate pollution from vehicles, power plants, and the oil and gas sector. Joseph Goffman from the Environmental Protection Network says the consequences could be swift, severe, and irreversible. Mr. Goffman, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate your talking to me.
The EPA has been in the news lately over something called the Endangerment Finding. I'd like to ask you to kind of give us an explanation of that and why it's so central to EPA's authority on climate regulation.
Well, I appreciate the question. The Endangerment Finding is basically an answer that the Environmental Protection Agency gave in 2009 to a simple scientific question, which is, given what we know, and that was in 2009, about the effect of greenhouse gas emissions on the atmosphere, do those emissions constitute a pollutant? Is it a form of pollution? Is it a form of pollution as far as science is concerned? And is it a form of pollution as far as the Clean Air Act is concerned? And the agency, EPA, answered that question yes. Now, it answered that question yes after the Supreme Court had already cleared the way, so to speak. The Supreme Court handed down a case in 2007 called Massachusetts versus EPA, in which they cleared up any doubt as to whether or not greenhouse gas pollution fit under the Clean Air Act, which is the federal statute to regulate all air pollution. And once they cleared that question up, they then said, because there was a pending petition asking the EPA to do so, that EPA was obligated under the Clean Air Act to answer that petition. And EPA went about spending at least a couple of years assessing the science, and I would emphasize the science that was peer-reviewed and was widely contributed to by an enormous community of experts and scientists. After assessing that, EPA said, what the science is telling us is that greenhouse gas emissions operate in the atmosphere in a way to cause harm to people, to harm their public health, to harm their environment, to harm their welfare. And by welfare, that also includes what happens in nature.
So that's a very, very helpful background. With that in mind, then, the EPA's recent move to repeal the endangerment finding has certainly sparked strong reaction. What's your understanding of their stated rationale for that repeal?
Well, I want to make something clear off the bat. I think that given my own professional background, my professional standards, I'm obliged by those standards to take the EPA's recent arguments seriously. But they haven't earned that. The arguments are borderline nonsense. A number of the arguments that the agency made earlier this month or late last month have already been presented to the federal courts and already rejected, both by the Intermediate Appellate Court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and by the Supreme Court. In some cases, the Supreme Court, when it handed down its decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, had already heard the arguments that the agency offered a few weeks ago and explicitly rejected them. So the agency is really almost defying what had been the settled law here by making some of these arguments. And the arguments are basically that not so much that the climate science hasn't been established, but what they've offered is a very tortured, I would say twisted interpretation of the Clean Air Act, and found their way through a series of alternative arguments to the same destination, which is that we, EPA, don't have the legal authority to make the endangerment finding. And because we don't have the legal authority, it doesn't matter what the science says. We're just not going to proceed on the premise that greenhouse gas emissions are a danger to to public health and the environment. Now, if you look at the document they put out as the proposal, they make several different arguments. They're made in the alternative. Their major argument is one of a legal interpretation. It hinges around the proposition that emissions from, in this case, automobile and truck tailpipes account for such a small percentage of the global greenhouse gas inventory that even regulating them doesn't offer a solution, and therefore the agency isn't authorized to make an endangerment finding. It's as if they're saying, we don't understand how we could solve this problem, therefore it's not a problem. And you can understand, given what I just said, and I don't think I'm misrepresenting their position, why I started off by saying that these arguments really are borderline nonsense. And where they're not nonsense, the Supreme Court, 19 years ago already addressed those arguments and rejected them.
I'm speaking with Joseph Goffman. He's the former Assistant Administrator of the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency, and he's now a volunteer with the Environmental Protection Network. Let's follow up. They've repealed the finding. What is the immediate impact of that for regulating, as you mentioned, vehicles, power plants, and other major sources of CO2?
Well, the immediate impact is shown right in the proposed repeal or proposed withdrawal of the finding, because part of that package is a proposed repeal of the standards that have been on the books for the last 12 or 13 years, requiring the makers of new cars and new trucks to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There have been standards put in place in 2012, 2015, I think. I'll go back. 2009 was the first set of standards. 2010, I think, when they were finalized, they covered model year 2012. And the agency has put out a series of standards, most recently in 2024, covering tailpipe emissions from new car fleets through model year 2032. The EPA's proposal is, now that we've withdrawn the endangerment finding on which these standards were based, we've erased all those standards. If this proposal is finalized, there will no longer be standards in any way, shape, or form for greenhouse gas emissions from automobile and truck tailpipes. So you take away the transportation sector. The agency made a proposal in June that's a sort of a sibling of this month's proposal, or the repeal of the tailpipe standards, that use the same concepts to repeal or propose to repeal a set of power plant standards regulating CO2 emissions from the power sector. I expect that they will sooner or later offer a proposal to repeal the methane emission standards from the oil and gas sector. So what you have is a sort of, a family of siblings being created here. The lead one is the lead action is the endangerment finding withdrawal. That knocks over the transportation domino. And then the same argument was used to propose to get rid of the power sector emission standards, and it could well be used to eliminate the methane standards from the oil and gas sector.
The Environmental Protection Network that you're part of obviously watches this very closely. What are you hearing from members of Congress? Are they expressing concern about this trend to deregulate?
Well, some are. I think, these proposals were put out at a time when, Congress was otherwise occupied and then went on recess. But there's some significant leadership being offered by and large Democrats in Congress, in particular the Senate. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's the ranking member in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, has been vocal and clear about this, and a number of his colleagues have joined him as well.
What would you recommend for communities or advocates who are watching this unfold? What should they be looking for? What might happen next?
Well, there's still time for people to file comments on the proposal. I think they're due in September, and the EPA website provides the information about about where to submit the comments, what kind of issues to address in them, and then when to submit them. But I think this is very much a political issue, and if people don't like this outcome and want to see the federal government continue to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, then probably the audience that needs to hear that are members of Congress at this point.
I've been speaking with Joseph Goffman. He's the former Assistant Administrator of the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency and now at the Environmental Protection Network. Mr. Goffman, thank you for helping us understand this complicated issue.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites in airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization. Really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business. And more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge. And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing, around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction. But of course, it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it. Share the credit. Perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.